The queen's gambit begins with white playing pawn to d4, and black responding with pawn to d5. White then plays pawn to c4, initiating the gambit. The classical response from black is pawn to e6, leading to the queen's gambit declined. However, to make the game more dynamic and put pressure on your opponent, I recommend deviating into the queen's gambit accepted, where black captures with pawn takes c4. This move often confuses opponents who may not be well prepared to handle this line. The captured pawn on c4 offers black some key advantages. It temporarily gives black an extra pawn. The pawn on c4 controls important squares in white's position, limiting their bishop's ability to develop actively, even if white pushes their pawns. Defending the pawn on c4 creates challenges for white's position. Most opponents at this stage may instinctively play knight to c3, which is a common response in the queen's gambit declined. However, in this gambit line, it often signals they aren't familiar with the subtleties of the position. This can provide black with an early advantage as the game unfolds. When black does not immediately capture the pawn on c4 but instead chooses to, white should respond with other moves. After white plays knight to c3, black can prepare to reinforce the pawn structure by playing pawn to a6, aiming to push pawn to b5 on the next move. This solidifies the pawn on c4, making it difficult for white to reclaim it. If white attempts other moves, black can proceed with pawn to b5, further strengthening the pawn's position. This puts white in a challenging situation, forcing them to work hard to regain the pawn. Even if white succeeds in reclaiming the pawn and developing their bishop, they are only likely to achieve equality, not an advantage. Meanwhile, black gains a natural square to fianchetto their bishop, placing it in an excellent position to attack white's pawn on e4. In most cases, white may try to break through by playing pawn to a4. This weakens certain squares in white's position, and black can exploit those weaknesses. At this point, a typical and powerful move for black is pawn to e5, counter-attacking in the center. This move allows black to seize the initiative, flipping the dynamics of the game and putting immediate pressure on white. Black is even willing to sacrifice a pawn to achieve rapid development and take control of the position. As black, you remain a pawn up, so even if you sacrifice a pawn, it merely restores material balance, meaning you're not truly sacrificing anything. Now, how can white respond to the attack on their pawn on d4? There are three typical options. White can capture the pawn on e5. White can push the pawn forward with pawn to d5. White can defend the pawn by playing pawn to e3. Let's examine these responses, starting with the most common one, pawn to d5, where white tries to push their pawn forward. This move is a mistake and works in your favor. After pawn to d5, black has the strong response bishop to b4. This move takes advantage of white's earlier pawn to a4, which prevents the pawn from attacking the bishop and blocks the a4 square, making it impossible for white to play queen to a4, which would otherwise check the king and attack the bishop. This weakened structure allows black to position the bishop comfortably on b4. White might then play pawn to e4, attempting to solidify their center and prepare to reclaim the pawn. However, black can continue the attack and prevent white from regaining the pawn easily. Here, black can play queen to h4, placing pressure on white's pawn on e4 and maintaining the initiative. Notice that the knight is pinned to the king, which means the knight cannot move. As a result, queen takes e4 becomes a real threat. Additionally, white cannot play pawn to f3 because this pawn is also pinned by the queen. This creates an unusual but highly effective situation where black's early queen attack becomes very powerful. If your opponent tries to defend the pawn on e4 by queen c2, you can simply attack it again by knight to f6. At this point, white is virtually defenseless, as there is no way to protect the pawn a second time. Black can either trade off the knight or continue exploiting the pin. Interestingly, many opponents will overlook the danger of the pin and play moves like pawn to g3 or knight to f3. In these cases, black can simply capture the pawn on e4, taking advantage of the pin. Since the knight cannot move, white will often be forced to trade queens. After knight takes e4, black continues to exploit the pin, applying pressure to the knight on c3. At this stage, black is already 2 pawns ahead, leading to a clearly advantageous endgame and strong chances of winning. Let's explore another option your opponent might choose after you capture the pawn. If white plays knight to c3, as usual, black can respond with pawn to a6, threatening to play pawn to b5 and solidify the pawn on c4. If white tries to prevent this, black can counterattack in the center with pawn to e5, putting pressure on white and forcing a decision about the pawn on d4. We already know that pushing the pawn forward with pawn to d5 is a poor choice for white. It's passive and allows black to respond with bishop to b4 and knight to f6, achieving a comfortable position. Now, what if white opts for the straightforward move and captures the pawn on e5? In this case, black can trade queens with queen takes d1, forcing white to respond in an awkward way. White either captures with king takes d1, leaving the king exposed on the open d-file, or moves the knight to recapture, which undevelops the piece. Either way, black gains a positional advantage. After the queen trade, black can continue developing by playing knight to c6, attacking white's pawn. Once white defends at knight f3, black can play bishop to e6, overprotecting the pawn and preparing to castle queenside. Black's position becomes very active, with the option to play bishop to b4. Pinning pieces or chasing the king, and knight to b4, adding more pressure. This leads to a strong and well-coordinated position for black. In some variations, the position can become very unpleasant for white. For example, if white tries to bring their knight back into play with knight to c3, black can respond with knight to b4. Which is quite annoying. White has no convenient way to stop a fork threat. If white plays passively, such as moving the rook to b1 or something similar, black can simply castle queenside. This creates a powerful threat with knight to c2, which could lead to a checkmate. Despite the material balance being equal, black maintains an attacking initiative, giving them a clear advantage and making the position difficult for white. Now, what if white defends more passively by playing pawn to e3 to protect the pawn? This works in black's favor as well. After trading pawns on d4, white is left with an isolated pawn on d4, which becomes a clear target for black. Black can immediately attack it with knight to c6, putting pressure on white's position. White might have initially planned to recapture the pawn on c4 comfortably, but now that becomes impossible. Instead, black's counterattack on the isolated pawn on d4 forces white into a defensive stance. On the next move, black can simply capture the pawn, gaining a strong position. If white tries to drive the knight back by pushing the pawn forward, black can reposition the knight to a5. While knights on the edge of the board are typically considered less effective, in this specific position, the knight on a5 plays a crucial role. It defends the pawn on c4, keeping black in control and maintaining the initiative. White may still regain the pawn and develop their bishop normally. However, black retains several advantages. For instance, the knight can jump forward to attack both the rook and the bishop, taking advantage of the fact that white no longer has a pawn on a2, leaving a useful hole for black to exploit. The knight is well positioned and safe, as white cannot effectively attack it, leaving them with no way to undermine black's position in this area. As white continues developing knight f3, black can bring out their bishop to place a pin, forcing white's bishop to a more passive square instead of an active one. Black can then follow up with knight to f6, further improving their position. Even if white pushes their pawn to d5, it remains vulnerable. Black's bishop pins white's knight, allowing for the possibility of trading it off, while black's queen and knight target the pawn on d5, leaving it defenseless. If white tries to pin black's knight in return, black can ignore the pin and boldly capture the pawn on d5. This aggressive play often catches white off guard, as they may not anticipate black taking the pawn so directly. The knight on c3 is pinned and unable to move, meaning white cannot respond effectively. If the queens are traded, black enters the endgame with 2 extra pawns, putting them in a winning position. Even if white recaptures a piece, black maintains control by attacking the pinned knight on c3, further solidifying their advantage and leaving white with limited counterplay.